everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist, Cass County. Don, how are you doing today? It seems like it's been so long.
I'm doing great. Yeah, it does seem like it's been a while since we've been able to record.
Here we are. We're recording on the last Thursday in July, and
The summer's gone fast.
July really went fast. So you had some time off.
Yep.
So we haven't talked to you for a while.
I missed a couple of podcasts.
Yeah. So what have you been up to?
All right. Well, I'm going to admit what I did. On July 3rd, I was getting ready to cut down a big old dead poplar tree. Okay, and I've cut other poplar trees down, but this is a pretty good size one. And so I thought, well, if I get rid of some of the major limbs, it's going to be easier for me to fell the whole tree. Now cringe when you hear this, because you know how sometimes a guy will do something and then after the fact you think it would have been better if I had not done that. Okay.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Well, to get these major limbs off, I was up on a stepladder with a chainsaw. And now when I say that, it's like, why? Well, anyway, I cut 3 of the main limbs off. They went fine. On the last limb, so I'm up on the ladder with chainsaw, I forgot to make the undercut. When you're cutting a limb off a tree, you make several cuts. The first being an undercut, just part way through, a little bit way through. And then you go above the branch, the limb, and cut down from the top.
And the undercut is closer to the actual tree.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep, closer to the actual tree trunk.
So that when you make that top cut, it'll swing down and then it'll catch that undercut.
Right, and then it falls clear.
Yeah, because a lot of times you'll see that where you'll make a cut. If you just cut from the top, it'll kind of peel back, and it'll peel back all the way to the tree.
And that is exactly what happened. I forgot the undercut. I made the top cut, and it remained, it remained attached, and it did exactly how you describe. It fell down, but it remained kind of attached. So anyway, it attached to the trunk yet. So I was trying to, with the chainsaw, get it to detach from the main trunk. And when it did, that big limb swung and knocked the ladder out from under me with chainsaw in hand. Luckily, the chainsaw dropped one side. I dropped the other. I tried to catch myself on the tree, got kind of bruised up, landed hard on my left shoulder when I hit the ground. Luckily, an MRI showed no internal injuries. It was 5 hours in the emergency room. No internal injuries, no spine and neck or head injuries. I'm very grateful. It did dislocate my left shoulder. Gosh, that was painful.
I think so.
But anyway, after hours in the emergency room, they got that all put back the way they do. And so now I'm doing physical therapy and stuff. And so I'm very, very lucky. And now in hindsight, of course, then our kids said that, Dad, you should not have been doing that. And so they contacted a professional tree remover and he removed the tree. But so now not only did we pay to have the tree removed, but now I have all the medical expenses too. So I would have been money ahead just to hire a professional because that's what they do. And so anyway, to anyone listening out there, there's a limit to what a person maybe should be doing. And cutting limbs from a tree with a chainsaw on a stepladder is one of the things that they say you should never do.
I've done similar ill-advised things, and when I tell my girlfriend Sam that, or my sister, they both tend to say things like, "This is the reason why men don't live as long as women." And
so I consider myself very, very lucky.
We all make bad mistakes, but we're very happy that
we do.
You're back with us and that you're doing okay. How did that your time up with your one arm, your left arm, kind of up in a sling? Were you still able to sit back and enjoy the garden, just looking at it?
Yes, I did. Although, you always see things that need to be doing. For example, the weeds continued to grow.
Yeah.
Flowers need deadheading, things like that. And I was able to do some things with one arm because I had the other one kind of in a sling contraption. And so I was able to do some things. But yes, I did sit and enjoy. And so it's fascinating. The middle of summer here, there's lots of things to do. And so now I'm happy that I'm back. I can hoe weeds. And I can do some of the things that need to be doing.
So let's talk about what are some of the things now that we should, because here we are, we're on the peak of the growing season now. The weather is really, it's got plenty hot. It's plenty warm. My tomatoes are just going great guns. What are the things that we should be staying on top of? Because, while we said in early July, we called it kind of Independence Day for gardeners. There's some things you can cut back on, but now there's a lot of things that you really got to stay on top of.
Boy, and you're right. And annual flowers in pots and planters and hanging baskets, they're just at their prime now. And of course, the root system is limited within that container, so they can easily run out of nutrition. So we should continue to fertilize every week. Every 7 to 10 days, give it a good water-soluble type fertilizer. And so that'll give it the nutrition to keep blooming. Otherwise, they can start running out of steam. This is especially important with geraniums also. Geraniums keep setting buds all summer long, and if we don't give them that nutrition, they start to kind of wind down.
What do you, as far as the fertilizer, because we're in really hot days now, and I think there's potential for some really, really warm days when this podcast comes out. They're talking it could be up in the 90s, and it's also very humid. How does that affect how you fertilize and how you water? Do you do water fertilizer and, at the risk of kind of getting some stuff on the leaves and
that's a good question, because fertilizer, liquid water soluble type fertilizer applied during the heat of the day and the sunshine, it can burn the foliage and the flowers. So either early morning or in the evening are the preferred. Early morning is kind of the preferred, just as the sun might be thinking about coming on up. That's really the preferred time. And then the fertilizer that gets on the leaves will have had a chance to dry and things. And so even if it's going to be hot, as long as you're not applying that fertilizer in the heat of the day, it seems to be just fine. And that also brings up the interesting point about fertilizer. It's best to avoid the blossoms.
Okay.
Because that getting fertilizer or even any water on the blossoms tends to shorten the life of those blossoms. The leaves themselves can absorb nutrition. Plants absorb fertilizer in two ways, obviously through the roots, but they can also soak up fertilizer through their leaves. So, for example, on geranium leaves, there's nothing wrong with getting some of that fertilizer solution on the leaves. In fact, the most common type, of course, that we see everywhere is the Miracle-Gro type. And when you read the directions on that, it mentions that you can apply it also onto the leaves because the leaves will absorb that too. So both roots and the leaves. Avoid the flowers, though. And so one reason for doing it in the early morning, whether you're watering or whether you're fertilizing, is in early morning, then the sun's going to be coming up and it'll dry the leaves off. If we water too late in the evening so that the leaves stay damp most of the evening, that's a good recipe for disease setting in, the different molds and things. Now, sometimes you don't really have a choice. You might get home at the end of the day and it's still kind of hot and you don't want to water at that time maybe. So sometimes we don't have a choice other than watering in the evening. So you kind of have to do what works for you. Sometimes if my workday maybe starts out early and I can't always water early morning, but try to water so that things do dry off before nightfall. So not the heat of the day, but also not right before night. Otherwise, any water on the leaves can cause mildews and different diseases.
How does this, when it's really humid, how does this affect your watering scheduling? Because sometimes, you'll go down and you'll put your finger in the soil and it'll stay moist for much longer than you normally does when it's this humid.
Boy, that is so true because the humidity, the leaves aren't evaporating as much moisture out through the leaves. And so I've noticed that we had a number of humid days without much wind. And I've noticed the pots and planters didn't need watering nearly as often. And of course, I always check the soil, mix. If it's moist, then I don't water. But for today, for example, it's hot and very windy. That wind blew all night.
Yeah.
And so this morning, before I went to work, I noticed, gosh, things are dry. And so I got everything soaked down really good, the pots and planters. And so, yes, whether it's humid, whether it's windy, greatly affects how we need to water,
Right.
especially pots and planters.
And the other thing, too, we want to keep on is deadheading some things, right?
Yes. For example, geraniums.
Yeah.
Geraniums are just a classic in pots and planters. They bloom so nice. And of course, you can bring them in over winter, too, so you get lots of mileage out of a geranium. Important to deadhead. So when that geranium blossom fades, if you just grab the stalk on which that geranium is attached and bend it down, it'll detach nicely from the main stalk. It's one of those things when you try, you say, oh, yeah, I see what Kinzler meant. So just grab the flower stalk, bend it downward, it'll detach right off. If we let geraniums, the flowers stay on, there's a couple of things that happen. It can start to set seed, which takes energy from the plant, and you won't get as many new blossoms. And also, secondly, those blossoms can tend to get kind of moldy, mushy, and there's a blight called botrytis blight that can enter that geranium through the blossoms. So a couple of reasons why we need to get those blossoms off. And also other annual flowers too. We can keep them blooming much longer if we do deadheading, meaning we remove the spent blossom before they start forming a seed head. For example, on petunias. No, it's not enough just to pull off the little withered blossom. We need to pinch back into the kind of the green part so that you're removing that little round seed pod. Have you ever noticed on petunias the seed pod start forming? Yeah, on some of the newer varieties, they're less apt to form those seed pods. The blossom just falls off without setting a seed. But if you do notice that enlarging green seed pod, make sure you pinch those off. And for example, snapdragons, after the blossoms fade, very common that they've got a seed pod forming. Cut that off, and then you'll get a nice new flush of blossoms forming. Marigolds. Marigolds, as the flowers fade, you kind of are left with that little crunchy old blossom.
Withered, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, then pinch that whole thing off. Marigolds are fascinating. When you pinch that old flower off and just kind of break that open, the base of it open, it's got all those long marigold seeds inside. It's fascinating. But left to go, of course, then the plant feels its time is done and it doesn't need to produce any more blossoms because it's already produced seed.
Yeah. What about like roses, things like that?
Yes. Of course, when I had my accident, I got a little behind on deadheading roses, and I noticed then they didn't rebound with another flush of blossoms. So on roses, and roses especially, if you deadhead those, the spent flower, go down to where you find a 5 or 7 leaflet leaf. Okay, well, what's that all about? Okay, right under the blossom, the leaf that's below that usually has 3 leaflets that make up that leaf. But if you go a little farther down, you'll notice, that leaf has 5 leaflets or 7. So cut down to that because that's where the best, strongest flush of growth will come that will produce new flowers on that. So continue to deadhead those on the roses. And also, if you never got around to your peonies and iris, if they still got a seed pod hanging on there or an old, spent flower that resulted in a seed pod, clip those off because we don't need to waste energy on those. And also daylilies, which are blooming now. As those flowers fade, they'll oftentimes start enlarging a green seed pod. So prune those off. Unless you're wanting to hybridize or experiment with growing the seed, there's no reason to have those seed pods left on.
Do those seeds, will they, if they're left on though, will that help them spread? Will that help them grow? Will they be able to drop seeds and spread a little bit?
That's a good, interesting question. Some plants that we grow, if you allow them to self-seed, then that's what comes up. For example, moss roses, which is an annual. If you've got a little area just devoted to moss roses, you can let them self-seed, and they'll come next spring from that seed that they drop. And sometimes there are other kind of wildflower type things that you just let self-seed, drop, they come back next year. But for example, daylilies, the seed doesn't ripen enough to fall and come back.
Okay.
Same thing with like peonies and things like that. I don't think I've ever, that's a good question. I don't think I've ever had a report of anybody that told me, hey, my peony, I left the thing on and I got a new little peony coming up right beside. And same with daylilies and iris. It seems like the seeds just don't shed themselves enough. It's interesting. In nature, I wonder if it's like birds that peck away at those seed pods maybe and spread them that way. But it seems like they don't burst and self-seed like some other things. Dandelions have self-seeding down pat.
Yeah.
But our perennials that we mentioned don't seem to do that.
Right. And then what about clematis? That's another big bloomer. I've noticed a couple coming up on mine, so it's really nice.
Yeah, and of course, I love the dark purplish blue called Jackman. That's one of the most prolific clematis varieties. And those are so nice. So make sure they get good water. They're blooming now. They'll bloom for another week or so, I suppose. And then sometimes they reward us with a bloom in September again. The flowers just tend to fade off. You don't really need to cut them off. The petals drop and they seem to be fine. But keep them well watered. And because if we get lots of good energy in them now, then they're more apt to bounce back in September again and give us another light. It's usually not the same dramatic flush as it is in the middle of summer, but some flowering on them in September is a nice bonus.
And especially now with the heat, it's nice because things, if you've got the wheat like we do, we have hostas growing in front of our clematis, so it keeps them nice and cool at the base, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you don't have something over the clematis roots, something to shade them, or if you don't have mulch, I like the shredded bark type mulch. If you don't have that over the clematis roots now, maybe it's a younger clematis or something you're trying to get established, do that. Clematis, I love the old saying, clematis love their face in the sun and their feet in the shade. And so, the hosta that you plant in front accomplish that. It shades it, keeps it more moist, and so, it makes a nice combination.
All right, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, more things to do to stay on top of your gardening tasks.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
Okay, we're back and we're talking about things to do here in the middle of summer, but to make sure that your garden's staying up to task, keeping you on task, but making sure your garden keeps doing as good as possible. And one of the things that, with this July heat, one of the things we're really noticing is how much we have to stay on top of watering our tomatoes, because tomatoes are really starting to come in. Ours are. How about yours?
Yeah, ours are too. Yeah, they're starting to form nice big tomatoes. Do you have a ripe one yet?
Oh, we had a couple of smaller ones that got ripe. Yeah,
Good for you.
We've had a couple of sun sugars. Those are really starting to come in now.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Nice. Our garden was late getting planted, so I don't have any ripe yet, or none starting to turn ripe. But one of the most common questions that I receive is about the disorder called blossom end rot on tomatoes. And what happens as the tomato is forming when it's green and then starts to turn red, and you notice that the bottom of that tomato is all brown, black, sunken, and it really affects the fruit, the edibility of it. And so anyway, let's talk about blossom end rot for a little bit. Blossom end rot it's not a disease as such. It's a disorder caused by the tomato plant can't get calcium out of the soil. Now, our soils have lots of calcium in it, so we don't need to add more calcium. It doesn't work to add eggshells or Tums or anything else like that. But what causes the plant not to be able to get calcium out of the soil is if the soil dries out in between watering. If it's wet, then it's dry, and then it's wet again. That inconsistent moisture makes the roots unable to get the calcium out of the solution. That calcium has to be kind of in a wet solution. Okay, so the best thing we can do to prevent that is to keep the soil more uniformly moist during the time that the tomatoes are forming fruit and right through the time that they're ripening and everything. So several ways we can do that. A mulch works really, really good. That helps prevent the drying out and then wetting and drying out. So grass clippings can be used if they haven't been sprayed with an herbicide. You could use straw, different materials like that. Could even use some shredded bark, a mulch like that. So anyway, a challenge in container-grown or raised beds, because sometimes they can tend to drain and dry out a little more than an in-ground tomato. So especially watch the watering on container-grown tomatoes. Don't let them dry out totally. Keep it a little more consistently moist.
Okay.
The same with raised gardens too. And then that consistent moisture will allow the calcium that is there to be in a solution, a liquid solution in which the plant roots can take it on up. So when you hear that blossom end rot is caused by calcium deficiency, that's true, but it's the plant's inability to take up the calcium that's already there.
And so doing something like a little bit of mulch around the base of the tomato plant
right, over the
really
root
help.
zone of the tomato. Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to have something like that? Because sometimes when you put a little mulch on, you want to have a little not pocket, but you want to have a little bowl maybe closer to the
kind
closer
of a
to the
donut
base.
shape.
Yeah,
maybe,
donut shape. Right. You want a little bit of that so that it'll hold maybe a little bit more water there.
Hold more water when you apply. So that's a great idea. And so now potatoes.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Potatoes and tomatoes are in the same family, so sometimes their care can be a little bit related. It's important in the middle of summer on potatoes also to keep the soil moisture a little more uniform, because this is the time when the potatoes are forming those underground tubers. And if we have too much fluctuating dry, moist, then the tuber formation is affected by that. And you can have more tuber roughness. Instead of the nice smooth skin, the skin can get rougher. And of course, the tubers won't size up as well either if it goes through dry spells. So now is the time to keep the your rows of potatoes well hydrated, the soil, and also to hill them up. Now, hilling up a potato means that you draw the soil up from kind of between the rows or around the plant. Draw it up and hill it up, mound it up around the base of that plant. That does a couple of things. That helps the potato tubers to form better underneath, but also it prevents the uppermost potato tubers from getting sunburn and turning green.
Okay.
Yeah, and that always happens to me if I'm not religious about mounding that soil up, hilling them up. And then when you go to dig them, and those that were close to the soil surface will be green. And green potatoes should not be eaten. And so hilling prevents that greening of those. Because it's a shame to dig up a nice potato and find that half of it is all green and needing to go to waste.
Yeah, you've invested so much time in that. You want to make sure that they're going to be do the best that they can.
Yeah, and also in the vegetable garden, watch for insects. The Colorado potato beetle, use spinosad. I think we've talked about that. That's a good one for that. And also on the cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli. If you see the white butterflies flitting around, occasionally there'll be a little yellow butterfly. Those are the adult moth of the cabbage worm. And those butterflies lay the eggs. They turn into these worm-like larvae that just decimate cabbage and cauliflower and broccoli, causing holes in the leaves. And when you go to harvest a broccoli, and you go to try to cook it or wash it up, then you find those little green worms in it, and it's very unappetizing.
Yeah.
So look for a good garden insecticide that is listed for cabbage worms. I keep 7 or 8 on hand all the time. You can either use the dust or the concentrated liquid. And apple trees. We need to continue spraying our apple trees for the apple maggot. And the apple maggot, of course, is that insect, very common, that when you go to harvest the apple, cut them open, and what looked like a nice apple on the inside is all brown and kind of has these little channels throughout it. And that is the apple maggot. So we need to continue spraying really right up through the first part of August, because those little adult black flies are continuing to lay their eggs, which hatch into the apple maggot internally. And so they'll continue to do their work. So we need to continue doing our work and spray for a while yet.
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing in my yard is that just how fast weeds are coming now.
Yes. I guess that's what makes them a good weed.
Right.
And yeah, they grow so rapidly. And so now isn't the time to let down our guard, because the worst thing that can happen is that if we allow the weeds to go to seed, and then they'll populate our soil with a seed that'll come back to haunt us for many decades. Those
Right.
seeds can last in the soil. And I can tell in our vegetable garden when I've let a weed go to seed, then the next year I've got all these little like redroot pigweed in that area. Or if I let a yellow foxtail, then I see a circle of those coming up. And same with purslane. And so, yeah, if we really do our best not to allow those to go to seed. Now, when mentioning weeds, lawn weeds, for example, I know I've got some thistle popping up here and there in our lawn, but in the middle of summer, those weeds get really tough. They get a waxy coating, and they're difficult to control. And a better option, rather than trying to control lawn weeds now, would be to wait until September. When the weather starts getting cooler, those weeds, those hard-to-kill perennial weeds, start to soften up a bit, and they're more apt to be killed by the herbicides that we use.
Okay.
So lawn weeds can kind of just wait a little bit. Let's see. Other things around the yard we can do. If sometimes at the base of trees, we'll get little sucker sprouts. Right at the base of the tree, very common on linden trees, crabapple trees,
Maples.
right where the trunk goes down into the ground, you'll get this proliferation of sucker shoots that come on up. And so now is a great time to prune those. Try to cut them as flush down to the trunk as possible. If you leave little stubs, they just resprout. And so a common question is there anything we can do about those so we don't have to trim them each year? There are a couple of products garden centers sell. One is called Sucker Stopper. Another is called Sucker Punch. But you have to follow the label really carefully as to how and when to apply those. Because they're not 100% control, but it's something worth a trying. If on some of those tree species, you're just tired of each year having to prune out those basal shoots. Because if you don't trim those out, you get a shrub growing from the base of your tree. Sometimes you'll drive along a boulevard, maybe it's maintained by the city or something, and they can't do everything right away. Sometimes it takes them a while to get to things, understandably, but sometimes you'll see these great big shoots arising right at the base of the trunk. But I noticed too, the city on their trees, they go around every so often and trim those all the way back.
How about, we were talking about the vegetables a little bit ago. How about my carrots? We've got what looks to be a good crop of carrots coming in. Anything I should be concerned about there?
Yes. We've talked about consistency and moisture on some things like potatoes and tomatoes. Also on carrots, consistency of moisture is important. So again, mulch the row of carrots or do something just to avoid the extremes of moisture and dryness. Because what happens is if we and sometimes this will happen after a rain, and we can't control that. But okay, if carrots are growing along, and then we get deluged with the rain, there's a rapid growth spurt, and the carrots crack. And the same can happen with tomatoes, too. If we don't keep them consistent and we get a generous rain and then there's a growth spurt and the skin of the tomato can't be elastic enough, and so the skin will crack. So the more consistent the water we can control, the more consistent the better, and the less cracking of carrots and the less cracking of tomato skin there would be.
All right. Well, let's take another quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the great things that we've got growing in our garden.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, we were back and we were talking about some things to do to stay on top of your gardening tasks, things to keep your garden in good shape here in just the peak of summer growing. But let's talk about just some of the things that you can look out or walk out into your garden, but the things that you're really enjoying right now. What are some of your favorite things in your garden? What's coming up? What's looking good?
Oh, and high summer is just a great time in the perennial garden. Perennial gardens just by nature are so interesting because in the spring has its certain perennials, and then kind of in May, June, you've got the iris and the peonies. And in the fall, you've got mums and asters blooming. And then in the middle of summer here, the height of summer, you've got certain things that are just outstanding. Now it's interesting. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a perennial that would start blooming in May and bloom right through October?
Be great.
But it's interesting. Old Professor Neil Holland, when asked that, when people would ask, gosh, I'd kind of like a perennial that would start blooming in May and go all the way through frost. And old Professor Holland always said, well, that one God has not created yet. And so there really isn't one. Some have longer bloom times than others. And one of them that I really appreciate is blue salvia, the perennial blue salvia. Now, one of the ones that I've been trying is called Blue Bayou. Not like the Louisiana bayous,
right?
But BYOU.
Yep,
Blue
by you, the individual.
Yes,
you did this.
Exactly. And it was an All-America winner from last year.
Okay.
And last year was the first year I tried it, grew beautifully. It overwintered well. And so it started blooming in May, just absolutely beautiful in May, early June. Okay, and then when the spikes faded, blue salvia and other cultivars too. One is called May Night, which is a beautiful one. Well, anyway, if those flower stalks are cut down to the level of the leaves, they will send forth more flowers. So Blue Bayou is currently blooming again.
Oh, you're already on your second bloom.
Already on the second
Okay.
bloom. So that is really nice. So it came back very nicely. Many perennials don't do that. I mean, you cut back the old peony flower, they don't send up another
Right.
one. Okay. But so the perennial salvias, I'm really liking that because now in the middle of summer, I'm getting another flush of bloom. They don't do continual all the way through, but you get this another flush of
Is the second flush
blossom.
any different from the first one?
Maybe not quite as dramatic.
Okay.
But still, some blossom.
Right.
I'd say 3/4 strength
Yeah.
from what it was earlier. So I'm loving that. And of course, the daylilies.
Yeah.
Daylilies are at their peak in middle of summer. And there are so many beautiful, beautiful ones. Now, of course, there's the little Stella d'Oro daylily, which is the little yellow one. That's the one that we see in front of every dentist office and doctor's clinic all
Mhm.
around the region. It's pretty. But wow, have the hybridizers developed some wonderful things. And I mean, I like daylilies that have big, massive blossoms because they're just so showy and have some height to it. For example, one that I really like is called Spider-Man, which
Okay.
is an intense red with kind of a golden center on it
Okay.
and just dramatic. And I should mention too, the daylily, the botanical genus of daylily is Hemerocallis. I've heard that pronounced different ways. Hemerocallis, But anyway, that is the Greek word that means beautiful for a day.
Oh, okay.
So daylily, each individual blossom on a daylily does last just for one day. But there are such a cluster of buds that they just continue opening and opening for weeks. Now, I do like, just to kind of keep them looking neat, after each one has withered, you can just kind of pluck them off, and then it keeps them looking nice. So sometimes when I'm making my walk around, it's fun just to take a walk around in the evening, see what's doing. So I'll oftentimes just remove some of the spent blossoms on those. Plus, then it prevents it from going to seed too. Another one of my favorite daylilies is one called buttered popcorn.
Oh, sounds pretty.
Yeah, I think I like it because of the name.
Yeah.
But it's a very large yellow with a little bit of a whiteness in it. And it's beautiful. So many beautiful ones. Another that's blooming now in the high summer is Shasta Daisy.
Yep.
And there are some new and improved varieties. And of course, new and improved, some of these varieties are actually new and improved. There's one called Becky that I bought from a local garden center a few years ago. And the Becky Shasta Daisy is a nice big white daisy with the yellow center, typical Shasta Daisy. But this one seems more prolific, has maybe a little increased winter hardiness to it. And just the flowers stand up just so strong. And so I really like that. Veronica, kind of a spike shape. There's flower colors of pink and lavender. Have you ever grown Veronica?
We have them. We love them. They are. Yeah. That is something I would recommend. It's a relatively easy plant. I've found it's not too fussy,
carefree.
But it delivers a great pop of color that lasts.
It does. Yeah, and man, the bees and things.
Great for pollinators. Great for pollinators.
It's fun. And what I get a kick out of is the bees. You can be within a few inches of that plant, and the bees don't come and sting you. They're so busy doing what bees do.
And it's also nice. It's nice to have a little bit of variety there because that's a very upright plant too. So that you can have some other bigger fillers around it or so, but this will add some height and it brings a different dimension to our garden. We just actually we put up a strip along our walkway where we peeled off some dirt or we peeled off some and we put in some things there. And I think we're going to put in some Veronica there too, because it's an allium. We're going to put in some alliums.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, the allium.
They're not in yet, but they will be.
That's another beautiful one. Some of the new hybrid varieties of allium, which is ornamental onion, and with those globe-shaped kind of lavender, deep lavender, pink. Oh, those are just a favorite too, blooming in the middle of summer. And you mentioned the spikes of Veronica. And of course, in designing a perennial garden, a well-designed perennial garden makes use of all those different shapes, of flowers and leaves and etc. For example, I mentioned the Becky Shasta Daisy. Of course, that's a flat, round flower. The Veronica is an upright spike-shaped flowers. So, the dynamics between the different shapes makes it all look so nice. And giant fleece flower.
Oh.
Giant fleece flower. I like the botanical name Persicaria polymorpha. It just kind of, rolls off your tongue. And giant fleece flower. Now, and giant, it is a giant. Yeah. It is overhead high. Sometimes I'm asked, what is that shrub that is blooming with the big poofs of white flower? And it looks like a shrub, but it's a true perennial in that it regrows each year from ground level. So it becomes a dynamic 6, maybe even up to 7 feet in height and at least 5 to 6 feet wide. So it's definitely something for the background where it has enough space to it. And the cream-colored flowers fade to kind of a tannish, and they do cling on all the way through fall. Now, I have tried cutting those off to see, would they rebloom? But they don't. Yeah, they don't rebloom. They don't seem to set viable seed. So because the flowers, even as they dry on the plant, are quite attractive, you can leave them on. There doesn't seem to be any reason why we need to cut those off. They don't seem to send up or form seed pods.
I know you wrote about that a couple of years ago, or at least that was the first time that I'd ever heard of it, was when you wrote it a couple of years ago. And it seems like since then, that's been something that people have been talking about. But that was a great revelation when you wrote about that, because we were looking for something for the garden and something to put in the back of an area.
Because offhand, most of us, we might ask, "Oh, got any peony or iris?" When we walk into garden center, but very few of us probably walk in and ask, "Got any Persicaria polymorphon?" and a giant fleece flower. So anyway, gosh, I'm also enjoying the tall garden phlox.
Oh, okay.
The upright phlox with the kind of pyramidal shaped. Boy, some of the nice hybrids. Oh, there's orange colors, there's pinks and purples. The newer varieties, too, are more disease resistant. Upright garden phlox are very susceptible to foliage type diseases that cause the foliage to become yellow and turn to brown. And so garden phlox, they're so beautiful. They're worth a little work, but I almost think it's worth applying a fungicide to them while the leaves are still green and healthy, because once they start going down to that foliage blight, they aren't coming back out of that for this year yet. So it's easy to apply these fungicides. On our garden shelf, it helps to have an all-purpose vegetable and flower fungicide on hand. I like the concentrates. Can just mix it up in a watering can and then douse the phlox with it when it starts growing in the spring, and then while the leaves still look really good and healthy. Some of those things are, it's an extra step, but boy, are they worth it.
Yeah.
And so many interesting things. Oh, around town, I've noticed around Fargo, especially in some of the Fargo Park plantings, the new varieties of catmint.
Yeah, if you're coming downtown Fargo, go on Main Avenue from Broadway west for a couple of blocks, and you'll see some great pops of color and they've done a really nice job with those.
Oh, they have. And of course, the catmint is kind of a bluish purple, kind of an informal mound shaped. And in some of the Fargo plantings, they have located yellow daylilies, low-growing yellow daylilies right beside the bluish lavender mint. And gosh, those have looked nice.
Yeah.
And so I'm oftentimes emailed the question, what are those plants kind of in the Fargo Municipal along Main Avenue and Broadway? What are those? Okay, well, the garden centers have nice new varieties of catmint. And, mint can spread, but not these.
Right.
These are tame varieties.
But they will fill out. They'll fill out some great space.
They will fill out.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. They won't take off rampant, and we won't see them, all over like we do dandelions. But they've got some interesting names: Cat's Meow.
Yep.
Cat's Pajamas.
Yep.
And so catmint on those.
And like we were saying about the Fargo Park has done such a great job with that. If you are a new homeowner and you're a little uncertain, look to those things there, because look, those are on high traffic areas. They can take a little bit of abuse, they can take a little bit of heat, and they can take a little bit of not getting watered every day. So that those are some good things to look for, of things that you could maybe use in your yard. And also, you can see how they look together. Rip off that idea, bring that home, go out and buy your own and plant them like that. And it's a great, I love the fact that the parks do that. And it adds so much color.
You are right,
and life.
because some of those are growing in squares cut out in the cement.
Yeah. They're surrounded by heat, and they're not in an area they're not on a drip line. They're not on regular irrigation.
Right. They aren't being pampered.
They are not being pampered.
Yeah, they are beautiful. Absolutely. Good ideas. Other midsummer blooming flowers that I'm really enjoying are lilies right now.
So many lilies.
Yeah. Now the and when we say lilies, we talked about daylilies. Daylilies are not a true lily. They grow from a fibrous root. The roots are a little thickened, but those are not true lilies, the daylilies. Okay, so next, talking about the true lilies. Those are lilies that grow from an underground bulb, kind of like an onion would. So these true lilies that are winter hardy enough, they remain in the ground. You don't dig them up, replant. these true lilies. There are a number of different types. Asiatic lilies is a lily category, grow from bulbs underneath. They're the upward-facing type lilies. And right now, as we record this, they're already done blooming. So they start kind of the end of June and the first half of July. Those are blooming. Then next, in blooming order of these true lilies, are varieties called the trumpet lilies and oriental lilies. And the trumpet lilies, instead of facing upward towards the sky, they face outward with big, huge trumpets. And for example, you know the stargazer lily that's in a lot of wedding bouquets, and you can buy them in the florist shop, and they have a really strong perfume. Well, they're kind of like these trumpet lilies. They're actually called an oriental lily. But anyway, it's that same big trumpet shape with the wonderful fragrance. And we can grow those in our flower gardens. In fact, I do some radio, and this morning I picked some of those and took them in as a bouquet to one of the radio shows. And as I was mentioning to them, the lilies plants that I took them off of are head high.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So many of the types grow quite tall. The Asiatic lilies are the upward-facing types, are maybe 3 feet or so in height. But some of these big trumpet lilies, they're 5 to 6 feet tall and just really dramatic in a flower garden. So they're blooming now kind of mid to the end of July. So again, it's by incorporating these different things in your flower garden, your perennial garden, you've got something different happening all the time. And yes, awesome. And and of course, we've already mentioned the clematis. It's fun to have a trellis of clematis close to the perennial garden because that gives some height. One of my goals, we've got clematis growing along a garage wall, but one of my goals is to, right within the perennial garden, to put a trellis and have clematis growing up on that trellis, because in the perennial flower garden, that'll give some height and a little bit of different dynamic going on within that flower garden.
And when they do flower, boy, are they show flowers.
Yeah, and of course, last year we did a podcast from your yard as well, and I enjoyed because some of the perennial flowers that you have are ones that I don't have. My bucket list is to have one of everything. I got a long ways to go. And so have you noticed any of the flowers in your yard this time of year that are especially dynamic?
Well, we had a blush of clematis already, and now we've got one that's I just saw this morning popped up. Certainly the fleece flower again. It's just such a great thing to see. We've got the daylilies have popped up, and those are really nice. The catmint and the catmint and then the salvia. We cut the salvia back a couple weeks ago, so that's starting to grow back again. But yeah,
one of the perennials that struck me so in yours that I don't have and I need to get, and I've heard it pronounced different ways. So you tell me how you pronounce Brunera or Brunera?
Brunera. Yeah, the Brunera, is that's we have an area along a fence. It's very shaded, and so we planted Brunera there in front, and then planted hosta. We had some hostas behind it. The hostas have swallowed up the Brunera, so we've got very dwarf Brunera. So we're going to have to move those out here at the when it's kind of safe to start transplanting some things.
But the foliage on those is so striking.
It's a really nice. It'll get very big. Kind of. I think this is called a Jack of Diamonds, and it's a green and a white silvery. But then the texture is a very kind of
the foliage is just dramatic.
Yeah.
And now, the old saying in gardening too is to grow it is to know it. Now, since I've never grown Brunera, I want to plant it, and so I'll know it better.
Yeah.
And so now it does produce a flower, correct?
Yep, early on.
Yep. So it's an earlier blooming type.
Yep.
And yeah, so it's fascinating. So,
Yeah, so-
I've got to add that to our plantings.
It is kind of a nice thing because the lungwort, the what are the bleeding hearts, all those things. So we have some nice early flowers, some early things that are coming in. But even after the flower is done, the leaves are a nice kind of contrast, a nice green with some white, some silver in there, and then the texture on it is this really kind of not quite prickly, but it's a little rougher than you would think. So it's really nice.
And isn't that one of the fascinating things about gardening is, I don't think I've ever heard anybody that said, even older experienced gardener, well, I'm done. I've planted everything.
No.
I've got one of everything. I'm done.
Yeah.
It's so fun. It's to keep expanding. You move things, you find you planted it in the wrong spot, you move it, you get some new things. Maybe something didn't impress you because the location just wasn't as good, so you find something that does. And so gardening, vegetables, flowers, lawn care, trees, shrubs, it's so dynamic, constantly changing and giving us new things to learn each day. And so I just find it totally fascinating.
And if you put in a little bit of work and stay on top of these tasks, the payoff is so great just to be able to, at the end of the day, if it's not too hot and the mosquitoes aren't bad, but to sit outside, it's really very rewarding. And if it is hot and the mosquitoes are bad, you can cut off some of these flowers and bring them inside and you still have some of that outside, inside. Oh, it's so nice.
It is. So yeah, talk about the rewards.
Yeah. Well, Don, if people have questions or if they want to send you pictures of their favorite things that are growing right now and flowering, what's the best way to reach you?
Oh, and it's great to hear from those of you that have written in. Thank you. Donald.Kinzler, KINZLER, at ndsu.edu. Oh, and I always love seeing photos of things that have just rewarded you with things that are doing so well. So thank you for everybody that responds in.
Yeah. And also thank you. We'll go back to our the Sanford nurses who listen to this show. Thank you very much for taking care of Don.
Yes. By the way, I had great care in the Sanford ER.
We're not endorsing, but we're just saying.
We are.
Yeah, that is true. Well, Don, it's great to have you back again and looking forward to talk to you next week.
Thanks much. Have a great week, everyone.